There are people who leave marks on the world not through what they built, but through what they destroyed. And then there are those who leave something far more disturbing than destruction. They leave silence. They leave an open wound in the history of criminal psychology. A question that decades of investigation, mountains of evidence, and thousands of analysts have never been able to answer with certainty. Not because the case was too simple, but because the mind behind it was too deliberate, too patient, too hungry for something that had nothing to do with survival, money, or passion. It had to do with something darker, something that had been forming long before the first crime was ever committed. The Zodiac Killer operated in Northern California in the late 1960s and early 1970s. He murdered at least 5 confirmed victims, possibly more. He sent taunting letters to newspapers. He encrypted his messages. He called police stations. He gave himself a name. And then, at some point, he simply stopped. No arrest, no verified identity, no final confession. But the most disturbing part of this story is not that he was never caught. It is that the pattern he left behind, in his letters, in the crime scenes, in the behavior, in the psychology, suggests a mind that had been shaped by something long before the killings began. A mind that had been building toward this, quietly, methodically, for years. This is not a story about a police investigation. It is not a story about codes or suspects or courtrooms. This is a story about how a human being becomes capable of something like this. What forms inside a person to make them seek power through murder, through theater, through the deliberate humiliation of law enforcement and society? What kind of internal world makes someone choose to announce themselves in Cipher, then disappear into normalcy? If you are willing to follow this descent, stay with us. If this kind of psychological storytelling resonates with you, the kind that goes beneath the surface of crime and into the architecture of the human mind, consider subscribing to Black Pattern and leaving a comment below. This channel exists for those who want to understand, not just be disturbed. Now, let us go back to the beginning, not the beginning of the crimes, the beginning of the pattern. To understand the Zodiac, one must first understand something fundamental about the psychology of individuals who commit predatory, organized, and theatrical violence. The behavior at the crime scene is rarely where the story starts. By the time a person carries out an act of deliberate, calculated murder, they have spent months or years rehearsing it in one form or another. The act itself is almost always the endpoint of an internal process, not its origin. What investigators, psychologists, and behavioral analysts have noted across decades of research on organized killers is that the behavior pattern typically begins in a period of profound social and emotional isolation, often combined with a persistent sense of being overlooked, misunderstood, or powerless. The crimes, when they come, are not expressions of chaos. They are expressions of a desperate and deeply organized attempt to impose control on a world that the individual has experienced as indifferent or hostile to them. The Zodiac's behavior, as documented in the cases and in his extensive written correspondence, fits this pattern with disturbing precision. Consider the letters. From the very first communication he sent to the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald in August 1969, the Zodiac was not simply confessing. He was performing. He was constructing a character, an identity, a role. He gave himself a name. He created a symbol. He embedded ciphers. He made demands. He set deadlines. He referred to his victims not as human beings, but as slaves. He spoke of collecting souls in the afterlife. These are not the communications of someone overcome by rage or impulse. These are the communications of someone who had spent considerable time imagining exactly what this moment would feel like. Someone who had rehearsed in private the feeling of having an audience, of mattering. That detail, the hunger to matter, to be seen, to be feared, is one of the most psychologically significant aspects of the entire Zodiac case. Because what it suggests is that long before the killings, there was a person who felt invisible. Now it is impossible to state with certainty who the Zodiac Killer was. His identity remains officially unsolved. But the behavioral evidence he left behind allows psychologists and criminologists to construct a profile of the kind of internal world that likely produced this behavior. And that profile tells a story that begins not in the darkness of a California night, but in the quieter, more painful darkness of an ordinary life. The FBI's behavioral science research, along with the work of retired investigators like Robert Graysmith, whose book on the case remains one of the most comprehensive civilian analyses, suggest a profile of someone who was likely white, male, in his late 20s or early 30s at the time of the killings, probably intelligent, likely employed in a field that required some degree of technical or organizational competence, and socially functional enough to avoid suspicion, not a visible outcast. Not someone who made people immediately uncomfortable, someone who, on the surface, passed. That contradiction, the ordinary exterior over the extraordinary internal catastrophe, is one of the defining characteristics of the Zodiac profile. And it is the element most worth examining, because it tells us something profound about how this kind of psychological damage develops. Most people who study predatory behavior agree that the foundation is laid early. Not necessarily through a single traumatic event, though trauma can be a factor. More often it accumulates through a pattern of emotional experience, the repeated experience of powerlessness, of not being seen, of not being valued, of social rejection or humiliation that leaves a residue in the developing psyche. In children and adolescents who go on to develop seriously antisocial psychology, researchers have identified certain recurring patterns. A tendency towards social isolation, not always by choice but sometimes by circumstance. An early development of fantasy as a refuge, a rich and increasingly private inner world where the individual can be something other than what they feel they are in reality. A growing preoccupation with power, with control, with scenarios in which they are the dominant figure. A sensitivity to shame, combined with an inability to process it in healthy ways. These patterns, when not interrupted, can calcify over time. The fantasy world becomes more elaborate. The gap between the internal sense of grandiosity and the external experience of powerlessness becomes wider. And that gap becomes, eventually, unbearable. The first warning sign in cases like this often does not look like violence. It looks like something much quieter. It looks like someone who seems fine, someone who functions, someone who smiles at work and keeps a routine and does not make waves. But behind that surface, something is organizing. Something is building toward an event that, to the outside world, will appear to come out of nowhere. The Zodiac's crimes did not come out of nowhere. They came out of a pattern. His first confirmed attack took place on December 20th, 1968, at a remote lover's lane in Benicia, California. David Faraday, 16 years old, and Betty Lou Jensen, 17 years old, were shot and killed in what appeared to be a targeted, deliberate ambush. There was no robbery. There was no apparent personal connection between the victims and their attacker. The location was isolated. The attack was swift. What the behavioral analysts would later note about this crime scene is what was not there. There was no evidence of chaos, no evidence of emotional overload, no evidence of a first kill in the sense of fumbling, panicking, losing control. The attack was cold. The perpetrator left. There was no attempt to linger, no ritualistic behavior at the scene, no emotional disturbance evident in what was left behind. That composure, in what was, according to the timeline, likely an early crime, suggests something significant. It suggests that by the time this person committed murder, the idea of murder was not new to him. The mental rehearsal had been extensive. 6 months later, in July 1969, there was another attack. Darlene Ferrin and Michael Mageau were shot at Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo. Ferrin died. Mageau survived, wounded, and within an hour of the shooting, someone called the Vallejo Police Department. The caller reported the shooting, referred to a previous double murder in Benicia, and hung up. That phone call changed the nature of the case entirely, because that call was not a confession made from guilt. It was not a call made from panic. It was a call made to ensure that the connection was made, to ensure that someone noticed, to ensure that the pattern, the killer's pattern, would be recognized as a pattern. This is a behavior that FBI profilers have described as a defining feature of the organized, mission-oriented type of predatory killer. The compulsive need not just to commit the act, but to be acknowledged for it, to be known. The crime on its own was apparently insufficient. It needed an audience. Think about what that need reveals. At its core, it is a need for significance, for recognition, for impact, for the feeling that one's existence has consequences, that the world is watching, that the invisible person is finally visible. For someone who had spent years feeling irrelevant, that phone call, those letters, those ciphers, those taunting headlines may have represented something they had never experienced before. The sensation of mattering. And that sensation, once experienced, becomes something that requires repetition. The letters that followed the July 1969 attack were sent simultaneously to 3 newspapers on August 1st of that year. Each letter contained 1/3 of a 408 symbol cipher. The Zodiac demanded the ciphers be printed on the front pages, or, he threatened, he would go on a rampage over the weekend. He signed the letters with a cross within a circle, the symbol that would become his trademark. The cipher was cracked within days by a schoolteacher and his wife, Donald and Betty Harden. The decoded message was disturbing in its specificity and its grandiosity. It spoke of the pleasure derived from killing, a detail that was later qualified in the minds of behavioral analysts, not necessarily as sadistic enjoyment in the conventional sense, but as a description of the psychological release that comes from the enactment of a fantasy long held. The message spoke of collecting slaves for the afterlife. It ended with several symbols that, despite decades of analysis, have never been fully decoded. That undecoded section has haunted investigators ever since. Some believed it contained the killer's identity. Others believed it was deliberately incomplete, another extension of the performance. Another way of maintaining control over what the audience could and could not know. A month later, in September 1969, a letter arrived at the San Francisco Examiner in which the writer referred to himself for the first time as Zodiac. The name was a deliberate construction, mythological, astronomical, designed to sound cosmic, permanent, unchained from ordinary human categories. This person was not calling himself a killer or a criminal or a man. He was calling himself something beyond all of that, something that operated on a different plane entirely. That self-construction, the mythology of the self, is another pattern worth examining carefully. In organized predatory psychology, researchers have noted that the construction of an alternate identity or grandiose persona often serves a crucial psychological function. It allows the individual to experience themselves as something other than what they privately believe themselves to be. The gap between the self that feels worthless, invisible, and powerless, and the self that is feared by an entire city and discussed on front pages across the country is the gap that the persona fills. The Zodiac was not simply hiding his identity, he was replacing it. On September 27, 1969, he attacked Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard at Lake Berryessa in Napa County. This attack was different from the previous ones. The Zodiac approached the couple while they sat near the lake. He wore a hood. He spoke to them before the attack. He told them he was an escaped convict. He tied them up. And then he stabbed them repeatedly. Cecilia Shepard died from her wounds. Brian Hartnell survived. The choice to use a knife at this scene, after previous attacks had been carried out with a firearm, has been extensively analyzed. Some investigators believe it reflects a desire for a more intimate form of violence, a need to be physically present in the act in a way that shooting from a distance does not allow. Others have suggested it reflects a desire to experiment, to vary, to maintain control over the nature of the performance itself. What is certain is that the killer left a message at this scene as well. He wrote on Hartnell's car door with a felt-tip pen, recording the dates of the Benicia and Blue Rock Springs attacks, the date of the Lake Berryessa attack, and labeling them as shootings and knifings respectively. He was keeping score. Publicly. Deliberately. He was creating a record. That record was, in many ways, the most revealing document of all, because maintaining a public record of one's crimes, announcing them in writing at the crime scene itself, is not the behavior of someone who fears exposure. It is the behavior of someone who craves continuity, who wants the story to keep going, who needs the world to keep paying attention. 2 weeks later, on October 11, 1969, the Zodiac shot and killed Paul Stein, a taxi driver, in the Presidio Heights neighborhood of San Francisco. This attack differed significantly from the previous ones. It took place in an urban setting. The victim was alone and had no romantic or social connection to his attacker. The Zodiac then cut a piece of Stein's shirt and used it as evidence in subsequent letters to prove his authenticity. The killing of Paul Stein has often been interpreted as a demonstration of a new phase. The killer was showing that no demographic, no location, no context was safe. He was expanding the theater of fear, and he was doing it deliberately, methodically, with the newspaper correspondence in mind. The letters that came after Stein's death became increasingly elaborate. The Zodiac discussed bomb making. He listed body counts, some of which do not correspond to any confirmed crime scene. He described a desire to attack school buses. He made demands. He mocked police. He compared himself to a collector of hunting trophies. He wrote with a kind of cheerfulness that was, perhaps, the most disturbing element of all. Because the cheerfulness was not the cheerfulness of madness in the conventional sense. It was the cheerfulness of someone who felt, for the first time in their life, fully in command, fully seen, fully powerful. The behavioral analysis of the Zodiac letters has been the subject of professional study for decades. Investigators and linguists have noted several consistent elements across the authenticated communications. The writing style shifts slightly between letters, but certain patterns persist. The use of misspellings that appear, in some cases, to be deliberate rather than accidental, a way of obscuring linguistic fingerprints. The occasional grammatical complexity that suggests someone with more education than they wanted to reveal. The alternating tone between menacing and almost playful, between grandiose and taunting. What emerges from the letters when read as a psychological document rather than a criminal one is the portrait of someone deeply preoccupied with their own image, with how they are perceived, with whether the narrative being constructed in the press reflects the narrative they have constructed internally. Every letter was, in some sense, a correction, a clarification, a direction to the audience. This is how you should see me. The need to control the narrative, to be the author of one's own story, is something that appears in the psychology of many individuals who commit organized, premeditated violence. It is not simply arrogance. It is, more precisely, a compensation for a deep and enduring experience of having no control over how one is perceived or valued. If the world would not recognize this person's significance on their own terms, they would force it to recognize them on terms that could not be ignored. The Zodiac forced an entire region of the United States to live in fear for years. He forced newspapers to become his platform. He forced police departments to publicly acknowledge their inability to stop him. He forced cryptographers, linguists, and behavioral scientists to devote enormous professional energy to understanding him. And then he appears to have stopped, or slowed to the point of vanishing. The last letter that investigators have reliably attributed to the Zodiac was sent in 1974, referencing the film The Exorcist in a commentary that was bizarre even by the standards of the previous correspondence. After that, silence. The silence itself has generated decades of analysis. Some investigators believe the killer died or was incarcerated for another crime. Some believe he continued under the radar, either through crimes that were never linked or through a decision to simply stop. Some behavioral analysts have suggested that the cessation of correspondence represents a form of voluntary withdrawal, a calculated choice to deny the audience the ending they wanted, maintaining control to the last by refusing to be known. That last interpretation, if correct, would be the most psychologically consistent with everything that came before it, because the entire trajectory of the Zodiac's documented behavior suggests a person who was always, at every stage, attempting to be the most powerful figure in the room. Even if the room was the size of a city, even if the audience was an entire nation, even if the power was built entirely on fear and uncertainty. To deny the ending, to refuse to be caught, to refuse to confess, to refuse to be identified, would be, in that psychology, the ultimate act of control. Multiple suspects have been investigated over the decades. Arthur Lee Allen, a convicted sex offender with an extensive list of behavioral and circumstantial connections to the case, remains the most frequently discussed. His handwriting did not match. His DNA, processed from envelope samples, did not match the tested samples. though the integrity of those samples has been questioned by some investigators. He died in 1992 without being charged. Other suspects have been proposed by independent researchers, law enforcement analysts, and armchair investigators in equal measure. The case remains officially unsolved. What the Zodiac left behind is not just a criminal case. It is a behavioral document, a psychological artifact, a record written in letters, in crime scenes, in encrypted symbols and taunting telephone calls, of what it looks like when a particular kind of psychological damage reaches its terminal expression. The damage began, as it almost always does, long before the first crime. It began in whatever combination of experience, temperament, isolation, and humiliation shaped this person's early years. It continued through whatever period of fantasy and internal rehearsal preceded the actual violence. It expressed itself through the killings, and then through the theater of letters and ciphers and demands and taunts, and it ended, or seemed to end, in silence. But the most important thing to understand is this: the Zodiac was not supernatural. He was not a force of nature. He was not, despite his own mythology, a being from outside the human category. He was a person. A person shaped by experiences, by psychology, by the accumulation of internal processes that, over time, produced something terrifying. Understanding that is not the same as excusing it. The victims of the Zodiac Killer, David Faraday, Betty Lou Jensen, Darlene Ferrin, Cecilia Shepard, Paul Stein, and any others whose names have not yet been confirmed, were real people. They had lives, relationships, futures. The terror imposed on an entire region of California was real. The grief left behind was real. What the psychological understanding offers is not comfort. It offers something harder and more necessary: the recognition that this kind of destruction comes from somewhere, that it has a pattern, that the pattern, in theory, can be recognized before it reaches its endpoint, that the invisible person, building a mythology of power in private, leaves traces long before they leave victims. The Zodiac's identity may never be confirmed. The case may remain, as it has for more than 50 years, unresolved at the level of law enforcement and official investigation. But the psychological portrait he drew of himself, through his own words, through his own behavior, through the choices he made and how to act, and how to communicate and how to disappear, is one of the most complete self-portraits of a certain kind of human darkness ever documented. He wanted to be known. He wanted to matter. He wanted to be feared. He achieved all three. And yet the deepest irony of his story is that the thing he spent so much effort constructing, the mythology, the cipher, the performance, the persona, was built on the most ordinary of foundations. A person who felt unseen and who found, in the most destructive way imaginable, a way to make the world look at them. The pattern was always there, in the letters, in the need for an audience, in the cheerfulness of the control and the fury beneath it. The most unsettling part of the Zodiac case is not the cipher that was never broken. It is not the identity that was never confirmed. It is not even the crimes themselves, as horrifying as they were. It is the silence after. Because the silence suggests something that behavioral science has struggled with ever since: that it is possible, under the right psychological conditions, for someone to do all of this, to kill, to terrorize, to taunt, to perform, and then simply stop, to fold the theater down, to return to the ordinary surface, to become, once again, invisible. If that is true, then the Zodiac's final act of control was not a letter, or a cipher, or a phone call. It was a disappearance. It was the choice to become, once more, the person that no one noticed. And somewhere, in that disappearance, is the most disturbing possibility of all: that the world he withdrew into was not so different from the world he had always inhabited. That the ordinary life, the surface life, the life that attracted no suspicion, was always there, waiting. That is the pattern. And the pattern does not end with the last letter. It ends with the realization that we may never know exactly where it began,